All right, let's unpack this. Have you ever really thought about the invisible scaffolding that holds a country together?
Hmm.
Beyond the daily headlines, what are the fundamental blueprints, the ones that define how power is structured and, well, exercised?
Yeah.
We hear terms like bicameralism or mandate thrown around, but if you dig deeper, what do they truly reveal about the, let's say, architecture of governance?
That's precisely where we're headed today. We're
Yeah.
taking a deep dive into the core structures of politics, these foundational ideas.
Right.
They determine how power is organized, how it's used, and maybe just as importantly, how it's limited. We've pulled together some fascinating sources that really unpack these concepts. Everything from the big picture, like constitutions, down to the daily workings of cabinets and how all these pieces, interact.
So our mission today is basically to give you a shortcut to understanding this political architecture. Hopefully reveal some surprising connections, maybe implications you hadn't considered.
Exactly.
We want to explore why these concepts, which can seem a bit abstract, aren't just theory. They're the living mechanisms shaping how governments work, how decisions get made, and, well, ultimately, how they impact your life.
Okay, so starting at the very foundation, you've got the Constitution. At its core, it's the ultimate rule book for a government.
The rule book.
Yeah, it defines the institutions, their powers, and crucially, it sets out the relationship between the state and the individual. Now, a key distinction our sources highlight is between codified or written constitutions.
Like the U.S. one.
Exactly, like the U.S. Constitution. It exists as a single kind of supreme document. And then you have uncodified ones, like in the U.K., where the rules are more spread out.
Spread out how?
Well, across statutes, common law, conventions, it's not all in one place.
Okay, so if I'm getting this right, a codified constitution, the written one, isn't just a document. It's considered higher law.
Precisely.
Its provisions are entrenched, is the word used, meaning they're designed to be really difficult to change, and the courts uphold them. That sounds like it offers a lot of stability.
It definitely does. That entrenchment, it acts as a safeguard, against interference from whoever's in government at the time.
Uh-huh.
And it prevents the legislature, the parliament, from having absolute unchecked power. But that rigidity also has downsides.
Like what?
Well, it can make the whole system less responsive when circumstances change rapidly. And maybe more controversially, it gives significant power to non-elected judges.
Because they interpret this higher law.
Exactly. So it raises this really crucial question. How do you balance that need for foundational stability with, well, the need for adaptability in a world that's always changing?
That's tricky. And speaking of balancing power, one common way legislative power itself is kind of split up is through bicameralism.
Yes, the idea of having two legislative chambers.
Two chambers, right?
It's a fundamental principle for many, many democracies. Most commonly, the second or upper house is subordinate.
Subordinate meaning less powerful.
Generally, yes. Often it functions more as a revising chamber, tweaking legislation, giving it a second look. But there's a stronger version, too.
Okay.
Think of the U.S. Congress. There, both chambers, the House and the Senate, are popularly elected and have, broadly speaking, equal powers. And the Senate has unique powers, too.
Like confirming appointments and ratifying treaties.
Precisely.
Our material points out the main benefits seem to be checking the power of the first chamber and the executive.
Right, adding another layer of scrutiny.
Widening representation, which seems especially important in federal system.
Yeah, representing different states or regions.
And just ensuring legislation is thoroughly looked over. But the sources also mention criticisms, like it can be inefficient.
Definitely. A second chamber can make the whole lawmaking process more complex, slower.
Yeah, I can see that. And it's interesting, the sources note some countries, like New Zealand and Sweden, actually got rid of their second chambers after World War II.
They did, yeah. Which suggests they ultimately decided that efficiency maybe outweighed the benefits of those extra checks.
It's a trade-off, isn't it? Like you said, speed versus extra scrutiny.
Absolutely. That's often what it boils down to.
And this whole concept of fragmenting power, it leads us straight into the separation of powers.
Yes, the classic doctrine.
The idea that government's three main jobs, making laws, carrying them out, and judging disputes, should be in separate branches.
It's really, really foundational to liberal constitutionalism. The whole idea of protecting individual rights, limiting government power.
Preventing tyranny, basically.
Exactly. Protecting citizens from potential state overreach. So the doctrine proposes not just independence of personnel, different people in each branch, but also interdependence through things like shared powers and checks and balances. The U.S. system is the famous example, often described as separated institutions sharing powers. It's probably the strictest application you'll find.
So the goal is fragmenting power to defend liberty. Simple enough. But the sources highlight a major potential drawback. It can be an invitation to struggle,
Yes.
leading to conflict between the branches or, as we often hear about, government gridlock.
Right, where nothing can get done because the branches are at odds.
Which makes you ask, doesn't it? How much separation is actually ideal before a government just becomes too paralyzed to function effectively?
That's the perennial question, really. Finding that sweet spot.
Okay, let's shift to the players, the branches themselves, the executive branch. What's its core role?
Well, in simple terms, the executive is the sort of essential engine of government. It's responsible for putting laws and policies into action.
Getting things done.
Pretty much. Its key function is to direct and control the policy process, basically, to govern.
And one of the biggest distinctions our sources make is between parliamentary and presidential systems. This is where, say, the UK and US systems really look different, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. They have fundamentally different ways the executive relates to the legislature.
How does that work?
Okay, so in a parliamentary system, the executive, the prime minister and their cabinet is drawn from the parliament and is directly accountable to it. The PM is, at heart, a parliamentary officer.
Right, needs the confidence of the House.
Exactly. Now, in a presidential system, like the U.S., the president is elected separately. They have their own independent constitutional powers, and executive authority is concentrated in that office.
And there are hybrids too, semi-presidential.
Yes, you see those quite a bit, systems that try to blend aspects of both. Maybe a directly elected president alongside a prime minister who answers to the legislature. It gets complicated.
The sources also mention that the executive's role seems to have grown hugely. Why is that?
Well, partly it's just the expanding responsibilities of the state in modern life, more services, more regulation, and partly it's the media's intense focus on individual leaders, on personalities.
Right, the leader becomes the face of the government.
Exactly. But that intense focus and the huge expectations placed on executives, well, that can also be their undoing, especially in this really complex, globalized world we live in now. It's a very heavy mantle.
Okay, what about parliament or assemblies in general? They're meant to be the people's voice, right?
Generally, yes.
Yeah.
Parliaments are usually treated with special respect. They're seen as the public, democratic face of government.
The link between the people and the state.
Precisely. They enact laws, they provide representation, they scrutinize the executive. That's the ideal, anyway.
But in the material notes that examples of truly policy-making assemblies, ones that actually initiate and shape most laws, are pretty rare.
That's true.
Most are described as policy influencing or sometimes even executive dominated. It sounds like maybe they lost quite a bit of power during the 20th century.
I think that's a fair assessment, historically speaking. A few factors contributed.
Such as?
While the executive often has a greater capacity, more resources, to formulate complex policy. Then there's the growth of huge government bureaucracies. And as we mentioned, the rise of mass media provided an alternative forum for debate, sometimes bypassing Parliament.
So parliaments became less central.
In some ways, yes. However, what's interesting is that our sources also point to a kind of recent revival, maybe.
How so?
Perhaps through things like stronger, more specialized committees that can really dig into government actions and hold the executive accountable, and also a trend towards more professionalization among legislators themselves. So it's not necessarily a one-way street.
Okay, interesting. And the third branch, the judiciary, their job is deciding legal disputes, interpreting the law.
Correct. And in liberal democratic states, the big emphasis is always on judicial independence and neutrality.
The idea that judges are impartial, above politics.
That's the cornerstone principle. Absolutely essential.
Yeah.
But the image of pure judicial objectivity, well, it can be a bit misleading sometimes.
What do you mean?
Our sources remind us that judges operate within a political context. They are, in a sense, political institutions, not just legal ones.
Okay.
Political influences can creep in, maybe through how judges are appointed. And there's the simple fact that judges themselves often come from quite narrow social and educational backgrounds, not always representative of society as a whole.
So it makes you wonder, how truly neutral can any human institution really be, especially when dealing with interpretation?
It's a critical question.
Yeah.
Because judges aren't just robots applying the letter of the law. They are actively constructing its meaning.
Which means they're essentially shaping policy, making law in a way.
In effect, yes.
Mm.
Especially when laws are written in broad terms, or, crucially, when a codified constitution gives them the power of judicial review.
Ah, judicial review, the power to strike down laws.
Exactly. The power to invalidate laws they decide are incompatible with the Constitution itself. That's a huge amount of power.
Okay, let's zoom back into the executive a bit. The cabinet. What exactly is its role?
So the cabinet is basically a committee of the most senior government ministers. Its precise role varies. In presidential systems, it typically advises the president.
More like advisors.
Right. But in parliamentary systems, particularly those based on cabinet government, it's theoretically the apex of the executive branch.
The main decision-making body.
In theory, yes. And it's usually underpinned by the principle of collective responsibility.
Meaning they all have to stick together publicly.
Yes. All ministers must publicly support government decisions, even if they privately disagreed during deliberations. It presents a united front.
And the sources say cabinets are important for that collective face and for coordinating policy across different government departments. Makes sense.
It does. But they also get criticized.
For
Sometimes for being just a cloak for prime ministerial power. You know, the PM really runs the show and the cabinet just rubber stamps. Or, conversely, for leading to messy, incoherent policy, because it's all about compromises between different ministers pulling in different directions.
So it's a tricky balance.
Very much so. And what's really compelling here is how the growing prominence of the chief executive, whether that's a president or a prime minister, seems to have challenged the cabinet's traditional status.
How has that happened?
Well, again, the media focus on the individual leader plays a big part. And there's often a perceived need for clear, singular policy leadership, especially when dealing with complex global issues. This tends to elevate the chief executive above the collective cabinet.
Our sources really drill down into the differences between a president and a prime minister.
Yeah, it's a key distinction.
The president combines being head of state and head of government, often elected separately, giving them their own mandate, their own power base.
Correct. They don't usually rely on the legislature for their position in the same way.
Whereas the prime minister's power flows directly from leading the majority party or a coalition in parliament.
Exactly. Their power is rooted in the legislature.
So on paper, it might look like a president has more formal independent power, but could a prime minister actually have more effective power?
Ah, that's a crucial nuance, and it's often debated. While presidents look more powerful, perhaps, with that separate election and single authority, their actual power is frequently described as the power to persuade.
Meaning they have to convince others, like Congress.
Right. They can't always just command. Now, prime ministers, if they command a disciplined, cohesive majority in parliament, if their party is united behind them, they can actually wield immense legislative power. They can often push their agenda through much more easily.
But that power is maybe more fragile.
Exactly. It's tied directly to maintaining that parliamentary majority and party unity. Lose that, and their power can evaporate very quickly.
And this leads to that idea of creeping presidentialism.
Yes. That's the phenomenon where prime ministers increasingly try to cultivate a personal appeal, almost separate from their party or cabinet. They use the media to speak directly to the public, trying to build that kind of personal authority, a bit like a president.
Interesting. Okay, so we've talked about all these structures, these roles, but how do people actually get into power? Elections seem like the obvious answer.
They are the most visible mechanism, for sure.
But our sources suggest there's a lot more going on with elections than just, ticking a box.
Oh, definitely. Elections are often framed as democracy in practice, this bottom-up process where citizens hold leaders accountable and express their preferences.
Right, the people choosing the government.
But they also have really important top-down functions.
Like what?
Well, elections help build legitimacy for the regime itself. They can educate the electorate, even if imperfectly, about issues and candidates, and they provide a peaceful institutional way to channel public discontent. So they're really a two-way street of influence.
And the actual system used for the election, that matters a lot too, doesn't it?
Hugely. The choice of electoral system has massive consequences.
Like majoritarian versus proportional.
Exactly. Majoritarian systems, like first past the post, used in the UK in U.S. congressional elections, they tend to produce strong, single-party governments, often exaggerating the winner's margin of victory.
But maybe less fair to smaller parties.
Generally, yes. Proportional representation systems, or PR, on the other hand, are usually seen as fairer because they try to link the percentage of votes a party gets more directly to the percentage of seats it wins.
But they often lead to coalition governments.
Very often, yes. Which can mean more negotiation, potentially less decisive action. Our sources really emphasize there's no single best system.
It's more a debate about what kind of government you want.
Precisely. Do you prioritize representative government that reflects all shades of opinion, or effective government that can act decisively? It's a fundamental choice with trade-offs either way.
And central to elections and just governing in general are political parties.
Absolutely. You can't really understand modern politics without understanding parties. They're organized groups whose main aim is to win government power.
They're described as the major organizing principle.
Arguably, yes. They act as this vital link between the state and civil society. They represent different interests, they recruit people into politics, they help organize the government itself once elected.
But they get criticized too, right? Our sources mention some historical fears.
Oh, yes. Early liberals sometimes worried parties would just promote conflict and division. And there are more modern concerns about them becoming elitist, bureaucratic.
That iron law of oligarchy idea.
Exactly. The notion that even democratic organizations tend to end up being run by a small group at the top.
And there's been talk of a crisis of party politics more recently.
Yeah, particularly in the late 20th century. Things like declining party membership, less voter loyalty, the rise of single-issue groups and social movements.
Suggesting parties were struggling to adapt.
It seemed that way. Struggling to connect with changing social identities and maybe new demands for more direct participation. But the consensus in our material seems to be that parties are more likely to transform and adapt rather than just, disappear entirely. They still perform essential functions.
Okay. Now, when a party wins an election, we often hear this term mandate. They have a mandate. Our sources make a distinction between a policy mandate and a governing mandate. What's the difference there, and why does it actually matter?
Okay, so a policy mandate is the claim a winning party makes that its specific manifesto promises, the things it said it would do, have been directly endorsed by the voters.
So you voted for us. You voted for these policies.
Essentially, yes.
Yeah.
A governing mandate, on the other hand, is simpler. It's just the acknowledged right to govern, to do the government, which is much more flexible.
And the policy mandate idea, it supports responsible party government.
That's the theory. It's meant to keep politicians accountable to what they promised before the election.
But it gets criticized pretty heavily, too.
It does. One big criticism is that it assumes voters choose parties mainly based on detailed policy platforms.
Which might not be true. People vote based on personality or habit or just disliking the other options.
Exactly. All sorts of factors come into play. And another criticism is that sticking rigidly to a policy mandate can act like a straitjacket on the government.
Making it hard to react to unexpected events or crises.
Precisely. If circumstances change dramatically, being bound by promises made months or years earlier might be counterproductive. Plus, the whole idea of a clear policy mandate really only makes sense in majoritarian systems where one party usually wins outright.
Right. In a coalition whose mandate is it?
Exactly. It's very blurry.
Okay, so even with a government in power, the health of a democracy also depends on the opposition, doesn't it?
Absolutely vital. The opposition refers to the parties outside of government that act as a formal check on those in power.
What's their role?
Well, fundamentally, they ensure limited government. They scrutinize what the government does, hold it accountable, question its policies.
Keep them on their toes.
Right. And crucially, they offer the electorate an alternative choice, a potential government in waiting.
Yeah. But the sources also note that sometimes opposition can feel a bit tokenistic.
Yeah. Sometimes it might lack real bite, or it can descend into what the sources call adversary politics, or even Yabu politics.
Yabu politics.
Basically, opposing everything the government does just for the sake of opposing it, without offering constructive alternatives, just shouting each other down.
Doesn't sound very productive.
Not always, no.
And alongside the formal political opposition, we have pressure groups.
Yes, another crucial part of the political landscape. These are organized associations trying to influence government policy from the outside.
So they don't want to be the government, they just want to influence it.
Exactly. They're not seeking power for themselves. They aim to shape decisions on specific issues or for specific interests.
And they're seen as important for democracy.
Very much so. They strengthen representation by giving voice to interests that might not be captured by political parties. They promote public debate on key issues. They broaden political participation beyond just voting. They're a vital check on government power coming from civil society itself.
So these are the groups campaigning on, say, environmental issues or representing business interests or trade unions, that sort of thing.
Precisely, all kinds of groups. But, like everything else, there are concerns mentioned in our sources.
Such as?
Well, one concern is unequal access. Some groups, perhaps those with more resources or better connections, might have privileged access to decision makers, drowning out other voices.
Right, the insider versus outsider group idea.
Exactly. And some critics argue the whole system can end up systematically favoring powerful interests, like big business. Another criticism is that a proliferation of competing pressure groups can lead to over-government policy becomes fragmented and incoherent because the government is trying to satisfy too many competing demands.
Wow, okay. We have really covered a lot of ground today, from the bedrock rules in a constitution all the way to the dynamic roles of parties and pressing groups.
We certainly have.
It's really clear that these structures aren't just, abstract ideas in a textbook. They are the living, breathing mechanisms that genuinely shape how power is won, how it's used, and how it's challenged in societies everywhere.
And what's so fascinating, I think, is the constant tension and the evolution within these systems. They aim for stability, for order, sure, but they're constantly having to respond to new challenges.
Like what kind of challenges?
Well, we've touched on the way media influence personalizes politics, for example, or the huge impact of global interdependence, which can limit what national governments can actually achieve on their own.
Yeah.
Problems cross borders now more than ever.
Right.
And this really raises, I think, an important question for you, the listener, to consider. As our societies become even more complex, more globally interconnected, which of these political structures that we've discussed today do you think will face the greatest pressure to adapt? And maybe more fundamentally, how might that adaptation change the very nature of governance as we know it in the future?
That is definitely something to mull over. Thanks so much for joining us on this deep dive.